Today we're pleased to introduce or to welcome to the Cerias seminar series Professor John Darcy from the University of Notre Dame. As you could probably guess from the nice suit and tie, he is in the School of Management there at Notre Dame, but does work in the impacts or the impact of technical countermeasures on risk in computer system security. He's come to join us here in Indiana after spending, I guess, pretty much his entire life in Pennsylvania, having gone to Penn State, picked up an MBA at LaSalle, and then his PhD at Temple. And so we're pleased to welcome him here to Indiana.
Thank you.
Cerias.
Thanks. Yes, I am from the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. I'm in the Department of Management. So I put a little picture there of Notre Dame for you. That's where I work. So basically my area of research and things I'm interested in are insider type security breaches. In this title, or in this talk, I use the term IS misuse, information systems misuse. Basically, people doing, whether it be illegal or inappropriate or just maybe unethical things with the use of computers, use of technology, and in the workplace. I'm focusing on the workplace. Again, I am from the School of Business, so my research is really focused on that area. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about, in general, what I mean by information systems misuse, and then I'm going to present a study I did, a large-scale survey of 8 organizations, and discussing some of their security practices and some of the things they have put in place that can be potentially used to deter information systems misuse, or these insider-type security breaches. Okay. So let me just say, too, if at any point anybody has questions, feel free. You can stop me at any time during the talk. This can be as interactive as you like, so there's no need to wait till the end. If there's anything unclear, just feel free to raise your hand. Okay, so just quickly, again, what I mean by information systems misuse, and I kind of went with the term IS misuse in this study because I saw that used a lot in the research or in the literature, so I tried to be consistent. But we're talking about things like, again, it's kind of a broad category. Could be illegal activity, illegal use of information systems. Again, like just software piracy would be something that's illegal. Could just be inappropriate, maybe using your employer's resources in an inappropriate manner, not as prescribed by security policy. Could just be unethical behaviors, looking at things that maybe you shouldn't be looking at while on your employer's time. Okay, so I gave some examples as well. Unauthorized modification of programs, unauthorized access. So an example of that would be maybe someone from, maybe somebody working in human resources looking up coworkers' salary information. They might have access to this type of information, but or maybe they know how to get access to that type of information because of where they work and their stature within the organization, but it's not necessarily appropriate. So things like that, unauthorized use of services, that would be maybe using the web when you're not supposed to be. You're supposed to be doing something else at that time while in the workplace. Software piracy I mentioned, and then the example there, purposeful interruption of computer services. There's been quite a few examples in the literature of especially more technical folks, people working within IS departments that have maybe been disgruntled, had some type of beef with their employer, and purposely put a virus on the network or done something like that, done something purposely to bring the network down. So that would be an example of an insider type incident that would be under that category of purposeful interruption. So those are just a few examples. Again, using the term IS misuse, kind of a broad category, but can encompass a lot of things. But these are the few things I'm going to focus on in this talk. Okay, so just quickly, kind of just to lay it out, why this even is an issue worth talking about. I think we probably hear a lot, just regularly, if you read any type of information systems or security periodicals, the insider threat is kind of a big deal. Oftentimes you'll hear security people say insiders could be potentially, the weakest link when it comes to security. But just a few numbers. You may have heard of this CSI study. It's the Computer Security Institute annual study that comes out. The latest one, 2008, 2 types of insider abuse type categories were found to be rather prevalent. Insider abuse of network access is what they call one, or email. And then what would fall under that category would be things like viewing pornography while at work, using unauthorized or using unlicensed software. They found that to be the second most frequently occurring type of breach in terms of just quantity and number of incidents in the latest survey. So some other research, they estimate between 50 to 75% of all security incidents originate from within the organization. Now I'm seeing some numbers that would say maybe that might be a little bit inflated. So some might argue that that's inflated. Still, external type attacks really are still the more dominant type. But regardless, I think most people would agree that insider type incidents are a significant threat, and they are happening. In terms of, if it's 50% or 75% of all incidents, that's debatable. A couple other numbers. There are some statistics to suggest that these insider type incidents are potentially more costly of the ones that do actually happen. There was a study done by Vista Research back in 2002, and of the incidents they looked at, they found that of security breaches that ended up costing organizations more than $100,000, 70% of them were insider type incidents. Okay, so maybe these are some of the more damaging ones, at least coming from insiders. A more recent study by Verizon, they looked at a bunch of security breaches, and they found that the ones that were attributed, at least originated, somehow had something to do with insider type activity. There was a larger number of them than ones that originated solely from external sources. So. And then typically, you hear most security professionals say, rule of thumb, about 1 in 10 insider security incidents is actually discovered. So if you kind of take that into account, these type of numbers that I'm showing you here, probably fairly conservative, considering that a lot of these insider incidents don't even get detected to begin with. So the numbers I'm showing you here are basically the ones that people have been caught. These incidents have been detected. Okay. Other thing. A lot of times organizations are reluctant to report this type of activity to the public. Embarrassment, their stock price might be impacted. It kind of paints a black eye on the organization if you come out and you say, okay, we had this security incident and it happened from one of our own inside. So again, if anything, these type of figures are fairly conservative. Okay. Okay, so in the literature on information security and kind of risk assessment and risk analysis, there's what's called the security action cycle. And really what they say here is, as I have in the diagram, there's kind of 4 strategies for dealing with systems risk when it comes to insiders. And the first thing is deterrence. The idea there is, okay, you want to deter people from even engaging in this misuse to begin with, something to stop them. So for instance, an example of a deterrent, in everyday life. Say, someone walks into a convenience store, a 7-Eleven or something, and you see a sign on the wall and it says, anyone that shoplifts will be prosecuted, or such and such, there'll be how much dollars in fine, you could go to jail, something like that. Right? Just a sign up there that makes you think, okay, if I was potentially thinking about maybe stealing something from this store, I see there's something there to maybe deter that activity. So that's what a deterrent is. It's kind of a more passive approach. Okay. The next thing, assuming in the security action cycle, assuming that the potential inside abuser, the deterrence doesn't work. Well, the next thing the organization would have in place is preventatives. And those are things that physically stop you. Okay, so access controls, for example, something where you have to enter a password, maybe a biometric control. Something that, as opposed to just deterrent that's more passive, something that would physically try to prevent you from engaging in the misuse. And then, assuming that the abuse got through deterrence, deterrence did not work, the preventatives did not work, the next phase is that detection there. Okay, so the abuse has happened. We as the organization, we want to detect it. And then finally, the last one is remedial actions. Okay, dealing with it after we've detected it. So in looking at these 4 parts here, these 4 phases of the security action cycle, as it's called, my research and what I'm going to talk about today deals with the first one, deterrence. Okay, what are some deterrent mechanisms that will help deter people from engaging in misuse within the organization? So before I move on, I kind of to some of the study here. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Again, we're focusing really on that first part here. Okay, deterrence. Okay, so some examples of what would constitute deterrence. Okay, so again, I mentioned more passive. I gave the example of maybe at a convenience store, a more passive type deterrent. Things like security policies, acceptable usage guidelines, okay, security education, training, and awareness programs, what I call SETA programs here. I'll be referring to them as SETA programs throughout the rest of the talk. And more active deterrence would be things like actually monitoring and auditing. Okay, so a more active attempt on the organization to actually do something. So now again, monitoring, it wouldn't be considered like a preventative because again, it's not stopping someone from abusing or misusing your resources, but it's telling them, okay, we're detecting it, we're watching it. Again, a more active effort on the part of the organization. And hopefully by them knowing that these type of activities are going on, they'll be less likely to engage in the misuse activity. So again, the difference between the passive and the active deterrence. Okay, so from a theoretical perspective, I'm not sure how interested you all are in the theory part, so I'll quickly go through it. Okay, so theory would say, okay, if you tell someone they're more likely to get caught and the punishment is going to be fairly severe, they're less likely to engage in inappropriate behavior. Okay, so this theory comes from criminology. So the idea is, the same with trying to deter drinking and driving. If you tell individuals, okay, we're going to have police checkpoints or sobriety checkpoints, there's going to be more police around, and the penalties, if you do get caught for drinking and driving, are fairly high, the objective is, okay, that will help decrease that activity. Same theoretical basis we're using here. So with the use of these security countermeasures, as I'm going to call them, and they're really the combination of these passive and active deterrents. Again, so if the organization has more security policies, SETA efforts, security education, training, and awareness efforts, and monitoring, from a theoretical perspective, we say, okay, well that should hopefully increase people's perception of the certainty that they're going to get caught and the severity of the penalty for engaging in these activities, thus decreasing the incidence of IS misuse. Okay, so that would be a theoretical rationale for why these deterrents supposedly should work. Okay. And I have here a research model. Okay, just quickly, this is kind of what I'm looking at in this study. And again, if you have any questions on this, please feel free to raise your hand. I tried to kind of succinctly illustrate what I'm doing here. But you see there on the left this user awareness of, and it says security policies, SETA programs, and computer monitoring. So in this study, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about actually how it was carried out. But we're looking at if individuals in the organization know that there's these security policies in place, that they know, that they're aware of these SETA efforts, okay, so they're getting constant communication and education on security type matters, and also if they know they're being monitored, there's a relationship between that and their perceived certainty of sanctions, or certainty, you can think of sanctions as punishment, the perception that they will be caught for engaging in IS misuse, and also the severity. So those things on the left there, the deterrence, the policies, SETA programming, monitoring, have a positive relationship on perceptions of certainty of sanctions and severity of sanctions. So basically these type of things should make people feel more likely that they're going to get caught and punished. And then towards the right of the diagram, where it says H1A and H1B, those stand for hypothesis 1A and hypothesis 1B. I'm predicting that, okay, and then this perceived certainty of sanctions and perceived severity of sanctions, as that's increased, the likelihood of IS misuse will decrease. Okay, so that's what that model is trying to emphasize. And I have there a couple other things, control variables. Basically what that means is over and above the effects of individuals' age, gender, their moral commitment, which is a level of how moral they say they are, and the organization they work in. So we're kind of saying, controlling for those factors, these are the things we're looking at in this study. Yep.
Can you describe the deterrents? Are those indicator variables, or how are you measuring that?
Yeah, so they will be measured, actually, they're measured on a Likert type scale, which is a scale of like 1 to 7. So basically in the survey, you know what, let me go through the survey in more detail, and then if that's still not clear, please raise your hand again. Okay. Okay, so without thinking too much about the methods of how this is carried out, this is the relationships we're trying to look at. I'm trying to look at this point. Anybody else have anything? So you can see the part there with the perceived certainty and severity. That's basically just a copy of that deterrence theory. that theory from criminology. And then kind of there's been an extension to that on the left, and looking at the impact of these deterrents. Okay. So here's the study to actually measure. Oh, and I should point out one other thing here where it says IS misuse intention. Okay, this is kind of a limitation of some of this research, but when we're asking people, okay, do you engage in these misuse activities? Well, I didn't have access to actual incidents of people engaging in these bad activities, right? So in the survey, we give them a few scenarios, actually 4 scenarios, and we ask them how likely would it be that you would engage in these type of activities. So that's where it says IS misuse intention. It's kind of considered a proxy, or something to measure behavior. But again, it's not their actual behavior; it's what they say they would do. Similar type methodology that's used like in marketing studies and things like that. So it's kind of as close as you can get without actually getting your hands on actual behavior. Again, in this type of research, if you go into an organization, you say, can you give me logs of your actual insiders who have engaged in some type of computer abuse? Most likely, unless you're buddies with the CEO, they're going to say, no, I'm not giving you that information, or else we don't even have that information. So this is kind of one way to try to get at that. Okay, so how we measure misuse intention in this study. It's basically individuals were given 4 scenarios, okay? And one of them involved sending an inappropriate email, one of them involved software piracy, one of them involved unauthorized access, and another involved unauthorized modification. Okay, so they presented with these scenarios, and together, their answers, after each one of these scenarios, they were then asked 2 questions regarding their intention. If they were in the same position, would they behave in the same manner? Okay. And again, based on the theory that we predict that perceived certainty of sanctions would be negatively related to misuse intention, perceived severity of sanctions would also be. So basically we're saying, okay, the higher the certainty and severity of sanctions, the less likely individuals would say they would engage in those scenario behaviors. Okay, those 4 behaviors there. Okay, I'll quickly, these are basically the same relationships that are outlined in that model. Okay. The one thing I didn't mention before, the control variables, why I even put them in there, again, when I was saying over and above the impact of these other factors, we're trying to look at the impact of the deterrence and the perceived certainty and severity of sanctions. Research, there's a lot of research to suggest that younger individuals and males are more likely to engage in risky or inappropriate type activity. There's a lot of research like, from social psychology, from criminology, from sociology. So we kind of know that probably males are more likely to engage in misuse, and younger people in general. So I'm kind of over and above those factors. Now that's an interesting thing to look at in and of itself, and I kind of have the data to do that if I want to. But I was kind of trying to look at the impact of these deterrents, the policies, the SETA programs, and the monitoring, without getting their impact mixed in with these other demographic factors. So when we say we control for that, there's a way statistically to kind of account for that. Okay. And the same with moral commitment. Moral commitment, I use that term because, again, that's something that's used a lot in the behavioral type IS security literature. But basically, it's how moral people say they are. And there's a way I measured that in the study as well. Okay? And really, actually, the way I measured it in the study was after each one of those scenarios, there was a question, and it asked individuals, how morally acceptable do you think this activity was? And that was on a scale of 1 to 7. Okay? So we have a measure of that. And then organization, again, there was individuals from 8 different organizations participated in this study. So that organization would be whether they were in organization 1 through 8. Okay, controlled for that as well. So above the impact of these factors. Okay. So the scenarios, okay, so again, for each scenario, each one of those 4 scenarios afterwards, there was 2 questions that measured the perceived certainty of sanctions. Okay, and it would basically be a question, and it would be like on a scale of 1 to 7. It would say, how likely would it be if you were to engage in this same activity that you would be caught in your organization? 2 questions worded a little differently, but that's what they were trying to get at. The perceived severity of sanctions, same idea. It would say, how likely or how severe do you think the punishment would be if you were caught for engaging in this activity, whether it be software piracy, the unauthorized modification, the unauthorized access, in your organization. And the intention would be, the questions would be, how likely would you engage in these activities? Okay, so those were all measured on 1 through 7, a scale of 1 to 7. Okay. They were actually aggregated to create kind of an index. So the answers for each one of these 4 scenarios were aggregated to create kind of a general index, okay, for each one of them. Your question about how do we measure the security policies and the SETA program and the monitoring, they were questions, and I don't have them with me, but I can give you some examples. They were, again, on a scale of 1 to 7, and they were questions like, how, for example, 5 items that make up the SETA program, how often do you receive security awareness communication in your organization? Questions such as that. How regularly are security type messages communicated to you? The computer monitoring items, they were questions such as, do you believe your organization is monitoring your computing activity on a scale of 1 to 7? So, basically, so higher scores meaning people perceive more awareness of these different types of deterrence. Okay. And in looking at the statistics, not to get too much into statistics here, but in looking at the results, there was a pretty significant variance in the responses. So we got good results in terms of, there were some people, looks like their organizations they didn't believe had these deterrents in place, or there was others that had very high scores. So there was a high variance in the responses, which is good for doing an analysis. So that was actually how the survey was. So the way the survey was kind of the first section of it was those 4 scenarios. After each one of those scenarios, they were asked these items. Okay, kind of section 2 of the survey, after they went through the 4 scenarios, they answered these questions regarding the policies, the SETA program, and the monitoring as it pertains to their organization. So the questions were set up in such a way, in your organization, or currently where you work, what's the extent of security policies, SETA programs, and monitoring. So in the title also, where I have user awareness, a key component, an interesting part of this research is we're asking the individuals, the end users, do they perceive these deterrents in their organizations? So it may be, you could ask a security person, a security manager, do you have such and such policy? Do you guys have security education and training efforts? Are you monitoring your employees? And they may say yes, yes, yes. But what we found in looking at doing some other studies is the end users aren't always aware of that. So in this study, looking at it from the end user perspective, okay, and that's really, I think, an important thing, because you could have all this great security in place. Just think of monitoring. If you don't think you're being monitored, that's obviously going to impact your behavior. So we're looking at it from the user perspective here. Okay, and these were the people that participated in this study. So it was end users, again, focused on, when I say end users, I'm talking about just the typical user. So it's not just IS people, it's not just technical people, it's kind of the typical, just regular computer users within organizations. So we got people from 8 different organizations. These are some larger companies across the United States. Basically, some of the contacts that were, in order to get people to participate from these 8 companies, I was working with a research institute when I was doing my graduate studies at Temple University. They gave me contacts to a bunch of people, a bunch of CEOs, CIOs, Chief Information Security Officers as well. Sent them letters, and I said, basically, can I get some of your employees to take this survey? So I sent that to, I believe, about 15 different managers. 12 responded. So that was a pretty good response rate. 12 responded and said, well, first they said, I'd like a little bit more information. What exactly are you going to be asking? Again, when you're asking about security type issues, companies get a little sensitive. So you got to make sure, we're not asking you too much detail here. We said, okay, we're asking people to take these, answer questions about these hypothetical scenarios, so it's not incredibly intrusive, but it is going to take a little of their time. So in response, we gave them, I have their $100 random gift certificates. So that was as an incentive to actually get people to take the survey. And it was 1 out of every 10 people that took the survey got one of these $100 gift certificates. I didn't mention here on the slide, but also in response, kind of as a little bit of an incentive to get the organizations to participate, I gave them each kind of a white paper, a little report, a little write-up about basically their employees' responses to the surveys as it compared to the 7 other organizations that would have participated. So kind of, little bit of how they did compared to some of the other companies. So we got a mix of users from various departments. In total, 269 usable responses. So 269 surveys that were filled out appropriately. The data was good. That's basically what was used in the study in doing the analysis. Okay. These are some statistical stuff. I'm not going to go through that in too much detail. Okay, and this is, you may not even understand the structural model results, but again, this is that same model I had up there before in looking at the relationships that we were trying to test for. Okay, basically, again, do these, which I have there, I call security countermeasures. Those are those deterrents. Do they have an impact on sanction perceptions, and then do the sanction perceptions, the certainty and severity, have an impact on misuse and tension? So what that basically all means is everything was as predicted, except for there was one difference. The security policies actually had a negative impact on perceived certainty of sanctions, which is kind of counterintuitive. It's saying the more security policies, or the more awareness of security policies on the part of users, the less they perceive getting caught. But everything else, at least in terms of the countermeasures, those relationships were as hypothesized. So higher awareness of SETA programs is associated with a higher likelihood of feeling like you're going to get caught, and also a higher perception of the severity of sanctions, and the same with monitoring. Yep.
Do you think that the negative relation between security policies and perceived certainty is because the very in-depth security policies, it's easier to find loopholes?
That's a good. That's actually a good thought. I put it in a paper I read up. I had a couple ideas, because basically I was trying to explain why this counterintuitive finding. So that would be something to that effect. Yeah, that definitely sounds rational, right? So if I explain that again, basically, the more...
Well, the more in-depth the security policy is, instead of saying something like use common sense, if you have this isn't allowed, this isn't allowed, this isn't allowed, then you can have someone say, well, it doesn't specifically mention this item, so that means I can get away with it.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I mean, that might be an explanation for that. Does anyone else have any thoughts? I'd love to hear them, because I could. That's the best. That's probably better than what I could come with. What's that?
I told you they are good.
Yeah, that was very good. That was very good.
Yeah. I mean, I would say generally the more knowledge of security policies, probably the more knowledge people have of the countermeasures, the detection processes, and and just could be more aware users of how easy it is not to be caught.
Right. I mean, they could be more savvy in general and feel like, okay, yeah, I know, just because I know this policy in place, well, I know how to get around some of these countermeasures as well. So.
One other explanation could be the more knowledge lowers perceived risk.
The more knowledge lowers perceived risk. Yeah, because that's basically what it is when you're saying, perceived certainty of sanctions. It's really perceived risk, how risky it is, how likely you think you'll get caught. So, yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, anybody else have any other thoughts on that? Yep.
Was there any, and you probably didn't ask this question or didn't look at this perspective, but was there any indication on, did these policies actually have enforcement written in them? I know you probably didn't get to that kind of, you're not looking at that kind of measure, but and perhaps that's an explanation too. Maybe the policies are just don't hold any enforcement.
Right, or people perceive they don't anyway, right? That's a good point. Yeah, so these questions were simply asking about the existence of policy. Different types, does it have an email policy, have a password policy, and kind of aggregated them together. But right, I think that's probably a good point. It's kind of the characteristics of the policy, and do people perceive them as enforceable? Do people perceive them as maybe having some teeth, right? Probably if I were to go back and do this over again, and kind of redo some of these questions, the security policy questions I'd put in a little more detail than simply asking, okay, are you aware of this policy being in place? I would get into more of the actual characteristics of it. And I think we'd probably find some different results or some stronger results for that relationship. That's a good point. So you can yes?
Hi, John. The antecedents to IS misuse and tension is perceived certainty and the perceived severity. So you get the perceived severity, -0.176, significant. the other one, negative 0.065, non-significant.
It's not significant, right?
Did you consider maybe looking at the interaction of those two?
Yeah, and that's I'll talk about that next. Actually, did well, sort of, and you can comment on it.
Certainty only matters when risk, when
Exactly.
severity is high.
Okay, so what I did, because that's kind of contradicts the theory as well. The theory would say both certainty and severity matter, and in my results there, I found that really only severity matters. So it wasn't the fact that people feel like they're going to get caught, but it was how severe they thought the punishment was, or if the punishment was perceived as being more severe, then they were less likely to engage in those activities. So again, I did a little bit more digging, and what I found was it depends on. I had the data, so this helped me. It depends on how moral people said they were. So I found some literature, and it makes a little bit of sense. So people that are more moral or perceive themselves as good people, right? For them, the impact of getting caught and getting punished may not matter. So you're saying, well, I would never do that anyway. I would never engage in that misuse activity because I'm a good person. Whereas someone that's maybe not as moral, or I shouldn't say not as moral, but does not perceive those behaviors as morally wrong, they may need these formal sanctions. They may need to feel like they're going to get caught and to get punished to influence them. Okay, so there was some literature that would suggest that. And my results were a little bit interesting. That they kind of bore that out. So this is what I was getting to. The research suggests that the influence of perceived certainty and perceived severity depends on moral considerations. So there is kind of an interaction effect. Interaction basically meaning it depends. So the threat of punishment is irrelevant or just generally much weaker for people that are more moral. So I split the sample into two groups, and basically for that variable for moral commitment, the question that asked them on a scale of 1 to 7 how morally acceptable you thought each of those misuse scenarios were, basically took the median of the responses. People that were above the median, they were considered more moral. People below the median were considered the less moral people. Okay, and then ran the statistics again on both of those groups. Okay, so a high moral group and a low moral group, and this just sums up those responses. So the people in the high moral commitment group, people that feel like they're more moral, or again, I should say, perceive those behaviors as not morally acceptable. Okay, the path from perceived certainty to intention was significant. Now again, remember before here with the total sample, okay, where everything mixed together, it was not significant. So that's saying that people that are more moral, there is an impact for perceptions of getting caught. Okay, so for people that are more moral, the threat or the perceived risk of getting caught has an impact. But you'll notice that relationship from PS, perceived certainty, to intention does not. And then it's opposite for the low moral commitment people. So if people that feel that are less moral, getting caught didn't seem to matter, but the severity of punishment matters. So, anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can see. So if you don't believe this is wrong, then really what concerns you is being punished. You're not so much afraid of getting caught because you don't think this is wrong, but
the severity.
But it's the punishment. Whereas if you think this is wrong and you're doing it anyway, you kind of just being exposed is
you don't like that.
Is kind of a self-punishment.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's basically what it's saying.
Well, it's still an interesting.
Well, I think if you kind of look at this from the practical perspective, then in terms of if you were a security manager or a manager in any way, how would you kind of evaluate this data? And I think it kind of one thing it says is, well, the impact of when we looked at the whole sample, the impact of getting caught, the PC relationship was not significant. But then when we split it down and we looked at the different types of morality levels, it did have an impact. So in general, it's saying both perceptions of getting caught and punished severely do have an impact, assuming you have kind of a mishmash of people in your organization that some might see these behaviors as morally acceptable, some might see them as not morally acceptable. So I think there is an importance there of both the PC and the PS, okay, the perceived certainty and the perceived severity. And considering that we see that security policies SETA programs and monitoring impact those two factors in different ways, it speaks to the value of these type of deterrents as well as having at least an indirect effect.
One thing before you go on from this, the moral commitment seems to be the biggest impact.
Exactly, yeah.
And are there other things that correlate well with moral commitment? How is that achieved? What is it that leads to high moral commitment? Do you go into that at all?
I don't really, but that kind of leads me, in doing this, the result, if you look at the numbers, and those numbers there are just the strengths of the relationships, you can see there the one from moral commitment to IS misuse intention has the highest number. It basically means of all these factors I've looked at, moral commitment has the largest impact on whether, people say they would engage in these activities. So even more so than getting caught and getting punished, and the impact of these deterrents on that moral commitment has a stronger effect. So in going forward now in future studies, I'm trying to look at some of the factors that can be used to influence people's perceived morality or moral commitment. Now there is some evidence like in the human resources literature and training literature that if people go through like ethics training, they can kind of, their level of morality or what they perceive as moral behavior in an organizational setting can be influenced. So that means, giving them specific types of security training and maybe focusing on the moral aspects. Like, for example, if you don't run your virus scanner or update your signatures or you don't check on certain email attachments, you could be harming your organization or other people around you. Kind of appealing toward the moral aspect. That might be a way of influencing moral commitment. So we know in looking at this data that moral commitment is a big factor that predicts whether people would engage in this IS misuse. So I think it's something that deserves more attention. So you can see it's really the strongest factor here. Does anybody else have any thoughts on how maybe you can influence people's level of morality? Some might argue you can't. It's how you were brought up. It's years and years of experience.
I think you're on the right track. A lot of it is dispositioning based. So one of the stories here might be from an organizational perspective. We need to be much better on the selection on the front end, who we bring into the
screening
process, because we can't change them once they're here, given that morals may be ingrained over 20, 30, 40 years. However, given that you have a moral person, they still might not know once they're in the organization which behaviors in a very complex organization are considered right or wrong.
Yeah.
They want to do well, but they might not know what's right. They might even look to the other people in their organization to give them information as to what's right, but that's not always good information. So they may think they're doing the right thing, but in fact engaging in behaviors that maybe someone else might view as immoral.
So that kind of gets to the education aspect as well. So it looks like, if people, right, they want to do the right thing, that morality is a big factor in terms of whether they do these type of things. Although we do see here that, there's still going to be some segment, of your organizational workforce that would probably be what we consider immoral, or at least wouldn't view these type of misuse behaviors as immoral. So based on the results of this, at least we can still see that if they perceive the severity of punishment to be high enough, that seems to have some impact anyway for these less moral folks. I mean, you can almost think of it, say, you even have like one or two, all it takes is one or two insider type security incidents to cause a lot of havoc. So I think it's still important to consider these results as well, that severity, giving people a higher perception of the severity of cost to deter them from engaging in these activities. But it is a good point that kind of a takeaway from this is morality does have a big influence on whether people engage in these behaviors. Okay, so that was what I call the post hoc analysis. Okay, so again, kind of in terms of that post hoc analysis, the interactive effect, it depends. We see that the results depend a little bit on whether people are moral or not. That's one thing that kind of came out of this. Okay, so perceptions of being caught seem to be a greater deterrent for individuals with stronger moral inhibitions. Perceptions of punishment severity seem to be a greater deterrent for less morally inhibited people, is what this data has shown. Okay, so that's the study. This is kind of the discussion, what it all means. Found that perceived certainty and severity of sanctions, They impact IS misuse intention over and above the impact of an individual's age, gender, moral commitment, and organization. So we did find that. Again, there's also the interactive effect, like we mentioned, with moral commitment. I have there, contrary to a number of criminological deterrence studies. So criminological studies are more studies that look at just crime in general. Okay. Again, people engaging in socially deviant behavior, like there's studies out there how to prevent people from smoking marijuana, or I read one where some people refuse to stand during the national anthem. So things like socially deviant behaviors. And a lot of those studies, it seems that perceived certainty of getting caught was a stronger influence than severity. Whereas this study in the IS security context, and we're looking at IS misuse, found that severity had a stronger impact than certainty. So it's really contrary to, in this domain, the results are a little bit different than a lot of the regular criminological studies. Again, I put there possibly due to a history of light sentences for computer crimes. This is just a thought on my part. There's generally people that have engaged in a lot of these computer crimes, we haven't seen them really been hardcore punished. I even know, people may have heard of Kevin Mitnick, who's considered one of the more famous hackers, and his claim to fame was he used social engineering techniques. And he hacked into a lot of large organizations, and I know his sentence was fairly significant. It was 5 years in federal prison, and now he has a consulting company. He's doing pretty well for himself. He's written a couple books. What's that?
He made it up.
Yeah, he's a reformed hacker, right? So he wasn't punished too severely. So maybe the whole idea of getting caught isn't necessarily perceived as entirely risky because the punishment hasn't been all that great if you're assumed you're just caught. So again, making people believe that the punishment is going to be a little bit more severe might be, this data would suggest, might be a better way to try to reduce these insider incidents. Anybody else have a thought maybe on why these results show that perceived severity of sanctions was stronger than certainty of sanctions beyond the one I just put up there? No?
When did you make your survey?
Oh,
how long ago?
the survey was done actually in 2006, the beginning, January of 2006. So it's a few years since the data has been collected.
What would be your expectation if you would do it today? Because all of these things, they are the matter of perception, and perception is affected by reality and environment. Now, what would you expect if you do the same survey nowadays? What would you get, especially in the industries which are affected economically, severely? Those industries which are affected severely economically and a lot of layoffs and stuff, what would they expect to get with all of these perceptions?
I still think in terms of the things I'm looking at there, like perceived certainty and severity, I think we'd probably get similar results. You agree? I
don't think so, because the environment changes perceptions.
So you're thinking maybe because the environment has, with the economic downturn and things like that, people will not feel that.
Because a lot of people, they thought they did the right thing, and they got kicked out. And a lot of people, they did a bad thing, and they got rewarded. So that's some of the perception in the society nowadays. At least if you.
It's an interesting thought, right? So.
But they're not getting kicked out necessarily because of misuse. They're getting maybe kicked out because the economy's tanking, right? And they're getting downsized. So they have to make that link that the downsizing is the reason that the economy's taking a hit and they're losing their jobs or experiencing sanctions because of their maybe risky behaviors.
As I said, it depends on when they look at their environments, what happened to the people around them, and then what happened to the whole society. So
you're saying people, maybe they're so down on things are so bad that the perceived risk, and even if they perceive there's a high risk of getting caught and punished severely, which in this case in an organizational environment could be something as much as getting fired, they just don't care. Could be.
As I said, what's your expectation? I'm not an expert in that area.
My expectation is, in terms of these factors, in a specific environment of the organization, I still think I'd get similar results, because I'm not really looking at too many external factors. But it would be interesting. Thanks.
To your original question, which is why PS would have a larger influence, is because even if I think something is wrong to do, or if I think it's right, whichever way, and I know I'm going to get caught, if the punishment is less than what I think the reward for doing it will be, then I'm probably going to do it.
Right.
And so if there's a higher, if there's a larger punishment, then the reward doesn't balance out. And so the basic idea is that people are more likely to do it if the punishment is less.
And that kind of also, you talked about interactive effects. I could look for an interactive effect between the PC and the PS, right? So one doesn't matter unless there's the other, basically, right? Yeah, and that's another way. I haven't done that with that data, but
You've got a severe potential outcome, but no way of getting caught. Doesn't matter either.
yeah. So basically, I mean, you could say those things aren't mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah.
They depend on each other.
I mean, even if the certainty of me getting caught is 100%, if the punishment is nothing but a
Zero.
slap on the wrist,
Then that's going to have zero
Yeah,
relationship.
exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yep. Couple questions.
Did your structural equation model, did it, when you did the analysis, did it indicate that you should consider a path there between those two?
I did, at one point I did a path between, I did a path from certainty to severity, seeing if certainty has a direct influence on severity, and it did. And it, one way, yeah. I did not do the interactive effect. To tell you the truth, I can't remember why. But I think I was trying to stick with the original classic version of deterrence theory. But I think I'm going to go back and relook at that data, because intuitively that makes sense. I mean, what you're all saying is, yeah, obviously one depends on the other. So that might be kind of a nice little addition to the way deterrence theory was originally conceptualized.
Is your covariance matrix available for this?
I can give it to you. Yeah, I don't have it on the slides.
Or, well, in the paper that you've, is this coming out, is this being published?
Yeah, the paper was actually just published in March, and I can email a copy to anyone if you like. Again, please do send me an email if you'd like a copy. I'll send it to you. It's jdarcy1@nd.edu. Okay, because it just came out in March, so I don't think the paper is yet available if you do like a library search. But I'll be happy to send it to you. It's just a PDF file.
For those of you who are not, who are all within ACM and RGB Explorer, the online library that John is talking about is from Informs. So if you go to Informs, you can have access to this paper. Maybe not now, but in a few months.
But I think you have to.
Without notes, so you don't go to Informs.
I think you have to be a member too.
I think we get it by
Oh, do you?
Purdue,
Some
yes.
informs, not all. Some informs journals, not all.
But either way, I can give you a free copy.
Is this an ISR?
Yes,
Yes.
It's Information Systems Research. It was just March 2009. It's in. And this research this was basically, at least a piece of my PhD dissertation that I did, this survey. So,
Did you look, did you test for like mediation effects for the security countermeasures on IS misuse? In other words, maybe computer monitoring has a direct effect on IS misuse. There's some other thing going on that explains.
right, that's a good question, and I did mention that in the paper. Yeah, I did test for mediation, and none of these relationships between security policy, SETA program, and monitoring were direct with misuse. They're mediated by the certainty and severity. Okay, so I did test for mediation. That was actually something that, in getting it published, the review team asked me to do that as well. Makes sense.
One thing, I'm not certain whether you have the data to support such a evaluation, but whether moral commitment varies depending on security policy. So for example, there's been some studies showing that allowing people to do some personal work on their work computers actually results in increased productivity. And I'm wondering if security policies that allow more
A little more lenient.
a little more lenient may actually lead to higher moral commitment. And I don't know if you could evaluate that in comparison with the company's security policies and or see if there's a difference between different organizations that's marked for some of the scenarios as opposed to others.
I could probably get access to their specific security policies.
Yeah,
and
because
look at them.
because it'd be interesting if a policy was allowed by a particular company, then they may perceive that as okay and show up very differently
Yeah, I mean, if anything, it may influence just people's overall satisfaction as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good point.
But, I'm wondering, you ask people to do, I mean, you're going to get a higher moral commitment if if your policies happen to jibe with what people believe is correct.
Yeah. And that might be a way of talking about how to influence moral commitment as
Yeah.
well. That might be a way to actually, practically, how organizations can do that by manipulating the policy a little bit. It would be an interesting study, too.
All I see is perceptions of bad things, of getting caught, and countermeasures, how it can stand against my bad actions. Did you look at the perception of the good thing that could happen to that insider by committing that crime? For example, making $100 million.
No, I didn't. So the benefit that they would accrue. No. It's a good point. Yeah. I simply, in this case, they were just, and the scenario was presented where it didn't talk about. Actually, I think I have in the slides here the actual scenarios, just so you kind of get a flavor for. I don't know how well you can see that, but these are the type of. So it didn't say anything about bad things happening to the organization. It's kind of a situation just presented, and then would you do this? Okay, so no, that's a good point though, because obviously they're doing that trade-off in their head, right? That cost-benefit analysis, you would
And
think.
it goes back to the question of the slave
Yeah.
that, I mean, maybe justifies the action, the
Yeah.
punishment. If the punishment is not high enough, what the heck?
Right, right. Did someone have their hand up back there in the last row?
Yeah, basically what I was saying is that there's a study by Gary Becker which is about application of rational choice theory to criminal behavior, which says the same thing, that if overall utility of doing a criminal behavior is more than having a legit behavior, you will do the act. So if the utility that you get out of misusing your information technology resources is greater than
The cost.
is greater than if you don't misuse them, you'll definitely go ahead and do it. So that would probably be a good framework to look to.
Okay, thanks. Rational choice theory, right? Yeah. I think another thing, too, that, just kind of wrap it up. So we see, and this is just in looking at the statistics, we see these type of things that, have an impact on misuse intention. And if you look at that number there, R squared equals 30, that indicates, from statistical sense here, that 30% of the variance in that variable is explained by these factors, which means that there's 70% of variance unexplained. It's still open, that other things explain people's misuse intention in terms of these scenarios than what I have here, these factors. So there's other things to consider. And one of the things that we talked about, you mentioned rational choice, which is the idea of people rationally will look at the costs and benefits. But I think some research is suggesting that people aren't always rational. Sometimes it's habit. Sometimes it's peer pressure. Sometimes it's your own some internal feelings. So the way I use deterrence theory here, and this is what's called classic deterrence theory, it's just perceived certainty and severity. There's something now that's called the more, I think it's called contemporary deterrence theory, where it adds in informal sanctions. So shame, embarrassment, these other type of more internal type things are shown to have a strong impact on people's willingness to engage in misuse behavior as well. So I'm going to kind of look at some of those type of factors in addition to just these more formal things that the organization can control. I'm going to look at some of them in the future and see the impact that maybe they have. Moral commitment would be an example of one of those type informal type things too. Your level of morality we see has a strong impact. But there's obviously some other factors that would predict this behavior than what I presented here. So kind of some area for future research. So, and again, if anyone, you have my email address, and if you'd like the paper, please do send me the email. I'll send it to you. And if you have any comments or any questions, please feel free to contact me. I'm always interested in talking about this type of stuff. Security behavior in general is kind of what excites me and what I'm interested in. So, does anyone have any more questions? Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you.